Chapter 20. December 1943. The air at Gear House was heavy, cloying, trapped inside the house until it could wake up from hibernation in the spring, protected away from the sharp, antiseptic smell of a Scottish winter. Outside, the Stirling's ancestral seat was being besieged by a relentless Highland mist that blurred the line between the grey stone and the leaden sky, a landscape as unyielding as the men currently pacing its floorboards. The Scottish mist had a way of infiltrating the soul, a damp, grey lethargy that seemed to seep through the thick granite of Gear House. Inside, however, the atmosphere was combustible. The library was a bramble of maps and tobacco smoke, where Josephine sat with a stillness that was entirely deceptive. Henry Druce stood by the fireplace, the orange glow catching the sharp lines of a face that had seen too much of the moosey woods. They shared a silence that was communal, forged in the terror of the Funk's Peal, that wretched radio game where Eve Mansoura's betrayal had turned their own transmissions into a noose. The static still rings in my ears, Joe, Henry said softly, his voice barely carrying over the crackle of their logs. He didn't look at her, he didn't need to. They had survived the Vosges together, two shadows dancing around the Gestapo's piano wire traps. Josephine adjusted her position in the wing-back chair, a sudden, fleeting wave of nausea rising behind her ribs. She masked it by reaching for a glass of water, her hand steady despite the internal upheaval. The Germans believe they own the airwaves, Henry. But they only own the noise. We own the silence between the pulses. She felt the weight of her secret, not just the botched mission to Colditz, but the one inside of her very being, although she did not know it. A jazz number came crackling onto the radio, delayed by a microsecond of silence. Josephine looked at the radio in horror, expecting William Joyce's voice, her heart pounding. "He can't get you in here," Henry counseled. "He can in here," Josephine confided, holding her head with her hands. "And I must be stronger." The man who was her very soul took some light steps to his Joe and draped his arm around her shoulder for a moment, then kissed her forehead very briefly, very lightly. "And you will," Henry told her, going back over to the table and continuing to sort through the maps. "What can he say about you? And you are here, back in Britain. And Paddy is with you." Henry glanced around the library. "No getting out of this place till at least a broken bar." He raised his eyebrows, comically. 1952? At this, they both laughed, which drew the attention of Galitzine and Armands, who were sorting the provision packs for the next day. Armands smiled to himself, though the prince did nothing but go back to his list. "Merriment," came the voice of Paddy Mayne. Armands and Seekings both looked at the door frame around which Major Mayne was leaning, then back over towards Josephine and Henry, who were still laughing. The room fell silent, and Josephine's head turned. Paddy looked as if he were about to say something, but then addressed the room. "Tomorrow is Christmas Eve. I know there is a war on," he added, rearranging his feet, "but Colonel Stirling has arranged," Paddy continued, rearranging his feet, and still glancing between Henry and Josephine, "a small dinner, of grouse, and the finest Scotch whisky that the Jacobite can rustle up for us." Paddy moved his kit bag to his hand, then held it in front of him. "Whisky?" he mocked, before pulling out a bottle of clear, colorless spirit. "Who wants something with a bit more life in it?" The room cheered as Paddy held up a bottle of Poitin. "So, get your work done by sunset today, and we will see in Christmas." Josephine turned back to her writing. There was a lot to cover in the 10 months in the field. She gave her reports to Bill Stirling, who passed them on to Dudley Clark. Most of what she wrote was repetitive, and she shook her head at the paper. "A dinner party," Henry repeated, his eyes moving in delight. "Now that will be something to look forward to." Not for her, Josephine thought. She would much rather go to bed early, and finish her field notes than drink and eat. She glanced at the words in front of her, Charlottenburg, where both Irish and Scottish nationalist representatives operated. She closed her eyes, remembering the Irish Scot who she had met in Runfunkos, then opened them, for a hand had curled around her shoulder. 88,888,888. In the Grand Library, where the shadows seemed to have accumulated over centuries, like identically bound books that say on the shelves. Josephine sat before a heavy oak desk. The scratching of her nib was the only sound, save for the rhythmic thumping of a heavy bag being assaulted in the courtyard below. Bill Sterling stood by the window, his silhouette a dark rift against the pale light, his presence a quiet pressure in the room. The masonry at Colditz is not the issue. Bill, Josephine remarked, her voice carrying the dry, clipped cadence of someone who had spent too much time whispering in Berlin alleyways. She paused, her hand instinctively hovering near the edge of her oversized military tunic before she caught herself and gripped the pen tighter. It is the psychological density. They don't just guard the body, they guard the very idea of David. To them, he is a trophy of the Reich's supposed inevitability. Bill turned, his expression a map of fraternal exhaustion. And the internal security? Dudley mentioned you found a fissure. A fissure is a generous term for a crack in a tomb, she replied, pushing the handwritten dossier toward him. I was within sight of the walls, Bill. I had the brioches, the false papers, the very smell of the local Gestapo office on my skin. But the movement of the guards has changed since the summer. It's no longer a routine, it's a fever. She felt a sudden, sharp lurch in her stomach, not born of the memory, but of her body. Somehow, Scotland, House, no longer agreed with her. The ink smelt stale, like seaweed rotting on a beach. And a name, insistent, lingering in her mind. Too. Why here? Why now? The training on the moorland had been less an exercise and more a penance. Under the brutal tuition of Paddy Mayne, the group, Druce, Armands, Gershaw, Sadler, and Seekings, had moved through the heather like ghosts made of grit. Paddy had stood atop a granite outcrop, his greatcoat billowing, looking less like an officer and more like some ancient, vengeful god of the very earth itself, like the gods of old, in Ireland, in Scotland, who merged land and sea, and belief and might. Beside him, Josephine had moved with a fluid, lethal economy that spoke of finishing schools and Irish rebellions. You're lagging, Druce. Paddy had bellowed, his voice cutting through the wind. If you move like that in the Ardennes, the Jerrys won't even need to aim, they'll just wait for you to die of boredom. You never were at Moosey, were you, Paddy Mayne? Came the voice of Prince Yuri. Moosey was their Somme, their Passchendaele, where so few came back that they were an anomaly. Josephine? Called Bill Sterling. When she still hadn't pulled herself from her trance-like thoughts, he shouted, Ethan, the name he had given to her, not knowing the significance, not knowing that Ethan Coyle and Sean McBride had been the closest people she had had, in hiding. She looked back at the papers she had handed over. How easily she had been bought, when McBride and Mrs. Coyle had hid her for 6 weeks over that Christmas, 2 years before, in a loft in a safe house, passing her up bread and ale, and apples and cake, then moving her from Cork to Clare, teaching her how to use a radio, how to defend herself with a gun. Ethan, Bill added, I have read the section about your brother. Your other brother. Josephine had not held back. She had described in detail the horrors that William Joyce had allowed Oswald Mosley to inflict on her to cause her to flee the Cable Street riots and be arrested. They had to know that to know what she had been fleeing. If she had stayed in Ireland, a broken bar in Ireland, with no family. Runfunkhouse was the broadcasting centre. She reiterated, I was not the only Irish person there. I was not the only non-English nationalist willing to hand over secrets for Irish support. And it is not just Gaelic and Cymric nations who had sold their souls to the Nazis for, ironically, independence from an allied power. Josephine pictured Eve Mansoura's face. Twice now that face had evaded death. Bill Sterling read the names. As Josephine pressed her right hand to her left hip, there was something a broken bar not right within herself. Henry had noticed that morning in the op-dash. These names? Radio Caledonia broken bar. Ronald MacDonald Douglas. Josephine nodded, remembering Henry's concerned face as she had been touching where the pain was. You're holding your left side, Joey, Paddy had remarked. Is the so teaching you to protect your liver? or are you just getting soft from all that German beer? Josephine hadn't smiled. She'd adjusted the strap of her gun, feeling the unfamiliar weight of her own body. I'm merely finding my new center of gravity, Robbie. Perhaps you should try it. You've been leaning into the wind so long you've forgotten how to stand straight. God's teeth, muttered Reg Seekings as he scrambled past them, sweat steaming off his brow. They're a pair, aren't they? Like two wolves arguing over who gets the throat. Had she thought she could forget it all, like that? She was here, in one of the remotest areas in the country, working in exchange for living. Josephine nodded her way through Bill's questions, then excused herself as quickly as possible, making for her room. She closed the curtains and lay, fully clothed, on the bed, and closed her eyes. 88,888,888. It was Druce who had woken her, past midnight, with men's laughter filtering up the stairs. The low-wattage bulb on the landing had become brighter in the room as Henry tapped, and he moved to her bed, sitting on the edge of it, with a plate of bread and cheese, and a glass of water. He told her of the evening, and the men, exhausted from that day's mission, winding down and into Christmas, and that they would be enjoying dinner tomorrow, and where the nearest church was, the chapel on Ear House's grounds, and how the Methodists and Presbyterians amongst them had protested, and how that protest was linked to Protestant ... But the prince had put a stop to sectarian talk and asked Colonel Sterling if he would object to interdenominational worship to mark the birth of the Saviour. Henry placed a hand on hers. Josephine gripped it, nausea waves passing through her. She had slept for nearly 7 hours, but would be happy with another 70 ... But your mother and your father are broken bar Ulster Scots are broken bar English are broken bar. Josephine shook her head. And I am Irish, and my cause is just, Josephine replied. I am here, with the so, not out of choice but out of desperation. The British government, Churchill, needs people who disobey the rules. Her mind flicked to Eve. How like they were, Josephine thought to herself. But, was she better than the woman? Eve had traded her lives for the prospect of Algerian independence. Had she not done something similar on the Newry train? Josephine shook her head in the some darkness. And I am paying for this now. It was to be hanged, or this. You pass for a good loyal citizen, Henry assured her. My life depends on it. But I miss Ireland so much, I do. And, against all protocol, Josephine told the patient Henry Druce about her life in Ireland, after she had run away from her life there, of the terrorist activities carried out in the name of Irish resistance. I miss the land so much, Josephine told Henry. Have you ever been to Ireland? Henry shook his head. The country is rich with history, with life just out of reach. But, what would I do there now? I have nothing to go back to there. No family. My only link is here. Robbie. Paddy, Henry echoed. I tried to live with my other brother, but William's idea of family is dark, twisted. I'd be by Robbie. Paddy, Josephine translated. I would do anything he asks of me, for he is the only blood I have to ever offer me kindness. She lay back down on the bed, and stared into the darkness. After a time, Henry lay next to her and they held one another's hand. 88,888,888. Christmas Eve came with a biting frost that turned the Highlands into a landscape of serrated crystal. In the great hall, the SAS contingent and the rest had gathered around a table laden with rations supplemented by local venison. The air in the great dining room of Ear House was a strange cocktail of ancient privilege and wartime pragmatism. Silver candelabra, dark with age but polished to a mirror shine, held flickering beeswax tapers that illuminated a table set with the Sterling's finest bone china, Wedgwood, and Bill marveled at the fact that his brother was held at the Friar's pleasure in Germany's answer to Stoke-on-Trent. The menu was a triumph of the Highland estate's self-sufficiency over Lord Woolton's rations. There were no national loaf grey slices here. Instead, the men sat before roasted grouse, the dark, gamey meat served with a rich logunberry jelly and parsnips pulled from the frozen earth that morning. To wash it down, Bill Sterling had unearthed a crate of CHA tilde Sensed Mouton Rothschild 1928. a pre-war vintage so decadent it felt almost subversive to drink it while the rest of Europe burned. Josephine sat stiffly in her pressed army tunic, the brass buttons catching the light. Beside her, Armands, Seekings, and Gershaw looked strangely civilized, their faces scrubbed pink, their battle-dress tunics stiff with starch. The smell of the grouse, usually a delicacy, hit Josephine like a physical blow. The rich, iron-heavy scent of the game bird turned her stomach into a knot of cold iron. She pushed a parsnip around her plate, her fork trembling slightly. Eat up, Joey, Robbie rumbled from her left. He was tearing through his bird with the efficiency of a raptor. You'll need the fuel. We're doing a 20-mile yomp through the corries tomorrow. The corries, Josephine thought, feigned eating copious quantities of the bird while the men regaled the dinner guests with tales of heroism, all true, from what Josephine could ascertain. Paddy Mayne moved among them like a restless wolf, his presence both a comfort and a threat. He stopped behind Josephine, not fooled by her con of eating the grouse, noting she had barely touched her plum pudding. You're eating so lightly, Joey, Paddy remarked, his blue eyes narrowing with a perceptive, fraternal intensity. And what's with the ginger tea? Don't you know there's a war on? Called Armands. They all laughed, Josephine too. Paddy did not. He was staring at her, accusingly. It settles my stomach, Paddy, she replied smoothly, meeting his gaze with a defiance that dared him to dig deeper. The Highlands in December are enough to turn anyone's stomach, Prince Yuri put in. I'm just not hungry, Robbie, she murmured, as he narrowed his eyes, waiting for her explanation. Josephine sipped the water he tried to replace with wine, defiantly. He stopped chewing. He looked at her, his blue eyes softening with a rare, misplaced pity. He leaned in, his voice a low growl for her ears only. You're still mourning that cold? It's business, aren't you? David is a sterling, he's made of granite. He'll survive the bag of bones. Stop punishing yourself by starving. You're not under a gaze. I am, and you know it very well. Josephine snapped back, biting against the instinct to heave all over the table. She wanted to be back in Ireland again, and in the landscape of the West, where she remembered being with her mother. Dunkeld had stood out on the map for her that morning, and Josephine's mind kept drifting to the poster for the Scottish National Party, and Ronald Douglas. We will make a stand at the ancient capital of Pitland, where our Cymric brethren have made their stand in all the ages past. A broken bar that had been before Josephine had known that John Francis O'Reilly had been sending covert signals through the airwaves. Douglas had been as passionate as Eve, as Josephine. To succeed to her, it was just the weight of the war, the failure to extract Bill's brother, and the lingering dread of the Vosges. She felt fragile, like glass that had been cooled too quickly. You're not coming out tomorrow, Robbie stated suddenly, loud enough for the table to hear. You look like a ghost in a storm. Consider it an order from your commanding officer, and your brother. Stay by the fire. Read a book. Be a lady for once. Josephine lowered her eyes, masking the flash of defiance. As you wish, Robbie. I'll stay behind. The light tasted bitter, like the wine she wouldn't touch. After the plates were cleared, someone cranked the gramophone. The melancholy strains of A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square filled the room, soon followed by the more upbeat, swinging brass of Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Could she get to Dunkeld the next day? Josephine considered. The tension of the mission planning seemed to evaporate under the influence of the Rothschild and the Poitin. Prince Yuri Galitzine, ever the cavalier, clicked his heels together in front of Josephine. A dance, Josephine? Before we all turned back into pumpkins and mud dwellers? She allowed him to lead her to the center of the rug. They moved in a slow, elegant circle. Yuri was a graceful lead, but as he spun her, the room began to tilt. The candlelight stretched into long, dizzying ribbons of gold. Josephine felt a sudden, rare surge of lightness. The nausea that had dogged her all through the grouse court receded for a moment, replaced by the warmth of the fire and the infectious grin on Yuri's face. I suppose I can manage one, Yuri. Just don't expect a debutante's poise. He took her hand, and for a few minutes, The war felt 1,000 miles away. They spun across the rug, Josephine's laughter ringing out, a bright, clear sound that drew smiles even from the stoic Seekings and Kershaw. She felt young, her tunic swirling as Yuri guided her through the steps with effortless Russian grace. She was smiling, her head tilted back, catching the light of the candles until she looked less like a phantom of the so and more like the woman she might have been in a different life. But then, the room began to tilt. The spinning wasn't just the dance anymore, it was a sudden, violent vertigo. The gold-framed portraits on the walls became blurred streaks of oil, and the scent of the men's tobacco and the rich wine became a suffocating cloud. Her smile faltered, her knees buckling just as Yuri prepared to dip her. Easy there, Yuri whispered, his tone shifting from playful to concerned. Sensing her strength failing, he didn't just steady her, he swept her up into his arms in one fluid motion, her boots dangling. The room erupted in cheers and whistles, the SAS men roaring at the gallantry. Put me down, Your Majesty, she managed, though her voice was weak. Josephine still tried to make it into a joke. I am setting you down, Mylea. In the best seat in the house, he replied, carrying her over to the large, velvet wing-back chair near the wireless set. He tucked her in as if she were made of porcelain. You are exhausted, rest. No more dancing for the weary. Josephine leaned her head back, the velvet cool against her skin. She let her eyes drift shut, the fading notes of the jazz and the crackle of the logs pulling her into a soft, hazy doze. Then, the music stopped. The silence was absolute, save for the heavy, rhythmic static of the long-wave radio. The festivities were interrupted by the crackle of a wireless set in the corner. Yuri Galitzine leaned over the dials, the screech of atmospheric interference filled the room until a voice, dripping with an affected, sneering poshness, cut through the room like a razor. A voice cut through the Highland night, a voice Josephine knew as well as her own heartbeat, but distorted by a sneering, theatrical malice. Germany calling. Germany calling. The room went icy. It was William Joyce. A very Merry Christmas to the Secret Service gentleman hiding in the skirts of Ear House, Joyce's voice drawled, dripping with venom. To the poor souls shivering in the damp of Britain, I ask, how long will you sacrifice your sons for a lie? I wonder, does Colonel Sterling know that his elite Special Air Service is little more than a collection of drunken poachers? And what of the darling Josephine? Does she still pretend to be a soldier, or has she finally accepted that her true talent lies in hospitality? We know where you are, Josephine. We know what you failed to do. Mosley misses his bed companion. Tell the men to enjoy their stolen grouse. It is the last taste of home they shall ever have before the Reich cleanses the moors of such filth. Josephine jumped to her feet, which was a mistake, for the hot, heavy room encircled her head, and she wobbled. Henry's hand caught her elbow, and guided her back down again. She felt her stomach lurch, for all eyes were on her. She knew the subtext of that broadcast. It was a signal of failure. In Leipzig, the radio spy Milo, John Francis O'Reilly, the last hope for the German resistance, must have been cornered by Joyce's own hand. Only the providential Allied bombing raid had allowed Milo to vanish into the smoke of a collapsing building, but the resistance was fractured, the transmission lines severed. Her brother's voice was a victory lap over the ruins of their best-laid plans. The silence that followed was deafening. The men didn't look at Paddy. They didn't look at Bill. Every eye in the room continued to be fixed on Josephine, who sat small and pale in the velvet chair, the echo of her brother's slander hanging in the air like poison gas. As the radio crackled to silence, the broadcast hung in the air like a foul odor. Josephine sat frozen, her brother's voice still echoing against the stone walls, stripping her bare in front of the men she led. Paddy didn't shout. He didn't lunge for the radio. Instead, he moved toward her with a terrifying, quiet gravity. He and Henry Druce exchanged a single, wordless look, and together they stepped to either side of her chair. Come on, Joe, Henry said softly, his hand firm but gentle on her elbow. "The Highlander has a way of catching up with you." "Time to sleep." Robbie took her other arm, his massive frame shielding her from the stares of the room. Their synchronized movement was a silent, ironclad rebuke to the radio's poison. They escorted her toward the door, their boots rhythmic on the floorboards, silencing every whisper before it could even begin. Once they had seen her safely to her room and returned to the hall, the atmosphere was brittle. Paddy stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of cold fury. He turned to the room. His blue eyes narrowed into slits. "In case any of you didn't know," Paddy began. His voice a low, dangerous rumble. "That creature on the wireless is her other brother. And like the so, he is trying to use her for his own gain. But listen to me carefully, she is my sister, my blood." The room was silent for a heartbeat before Mike Sadler spoke up from the shadows near the map table. "Paddy, we know." Sadler stepped forward, his expression earnest. "None of us doubt her. How could we, after what she went through to help Major Sterling, to go into the Reich, to kill, to come back, and then prepare to go again? That's what David told us. She's more SAS than any of us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered men. Reg Seekings nodded firmly, and even the stoic Armands offered a sharp, supportive grunt. Paddy eyeballed them one by one, his gaze searching for any hint of hesitation. Finding none, he imperceptibly shifted his feet, the tension in his shoulders dropping just a fraction. Not knowing that, while none under Kia House's roof doubted Josephine, it was she who was doubting herself. He agreed, his voice gruff. "I know. But if she has any ideas about joining us first thing tomorrow, you better send her right back. She's reached her limit for 1 year." "Yes, Paddy," came the chorus of replies. "Yes, sir." The murmurs were polite, but entirely hollow. They all knew Josephine. She operated in the shadows between orders and instinct. If she wanted to be on that moor at dawn, no power in the Highlands, not even her brother, would stop her. The radio was still scratching, a rhythmic, abrasive hiss as it struggled to find a new signal. "Switch that bloody thing off," Paddy commanded, "or put on the light program." He reached for the bottle of poitin, holding it aloft like a weapon. "I'm getting drunk." "Who's joining me?"